Hello, welcome to another episode of Purple Insider. Matthew Coller here, and joining me is Eric Eager, who has now left Pro Football Focus to join Sumer Sports to take over the National Football League and its analytics. Eric, I'm very happy for you with this move from PFF to Sumer Sports, and I'm listening to your new show that you are doing with Thomas Dimitrov, former NFL general manager. But I have to say, and this is with respect to Ben Brown and Brad Spielberger, guys that have come on the show, and I love them, the forecast will never be the same without you and George together. So I'm happy for you, but I'm also a little sad because that's my jogging show. So now I'm having to like split. It's like when your parents break up or something.
Well, and honestly, that's like how, and I don't know if George will listen to this, but like, it sort of is how it felt. It was sort of like a breakup, you're both, graduating, going to college or something like that in different towns, and it just wasn't going to work. And I know we did a few shows after I announced, and, we did our final show. And I got to say, like, I cried enough at the end of that show where I was dead ass supposed to go on the show that I do with Seren Petro, the Red, Gold, and Bold show with him, me, and Jeff Jadia. And I'm like, guys, I got to be like 10 minutes late here. I'm trying. I'm trying to get around this. But yeah, I mean, it certainly, it was 4.5 years and one Vikings playoff appearance. But I really enjoyed that show. And I'm really enjoying getting to learn from Thomas and learn from some really sharp people who have both worked in the league, who have worked outside the league as consultants. With Sumer, that was one of the reasons I really liked Sumer. The idea of Sumer Sports was, everybody that, at PFF, I mean, Timo Risky was a genius in my estimation. Ben Brown was fantastic. Brad Spielberger is amazing, as your listeners know. It was good to, go to another group that had, fantastic talent and working on very interesting problems.
Right. So you're creating this podcast that people can listen to, the Sumer Sports Show. It's SUMER. And also working on the other side, which is building products for teams and things like that, which I won't ask you to go deep into, but it's a very cool advancement of your career. Happy to hear it. But now we need to talk about the Minnesota Vikings, who are 5-1. You started this off taking a jab how they've missed the playoffs, but now it's actually going to take work for them to miss the playoffs after they've started 5-1. I think we need to just begin with the broad discussion. And maybe you could tell me kind of how we should look at this from a numbers perspective. When you start off a season this hot, it's almost hard to let it slip through your fingers, which I know Vikings fans are going like, oh, is that a dare? Because this team has before. But the landscape of the league is what I really want to focus on here with you. What is going on with this league? Just today, as we record this, Arizona lost their guard and they lost their starting wide receiver. Carson Wentz gets hurt for Washington. And oh, look, those are the Vikings' next two opponents. I looked at the PFF passing grades and went down the list. They are the lowest I've ever seen outside of like the top three. You have Jalen Hurts is playing fantastic football. Josh Allen is just like John Elway out there. And of course, Patrick Mahomes, and those guys are at the top. And then it's like everybody else looks like Daniel Jones and is comparable to him. Kirk is ranked 6th, and this is by far the worst he's played as a Minnesota Viking quarterback. So your thoughts?
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I mean, growing up in Minnesota, I remember them starting 5-1 in 2004, finishing 3-7 and going 8-8, and then beating Green Bay in the playoffs. Sort of knowing how this can go. The prior year to that, Mike Tice started 6-0, finished 3-7 again, missed the playoffs. And then, your first year covering the team in 16, they started out 5-0 and missed the playoffs. So, they certainly can happen. But, I was just looking at the PFF simulation, the one that myself and Timo Risky built, and they have the Vikings not only with a 76% chance to make the playoffs, but it was 76% to win the division, right? So, that bodes well for Minnesota. Green Bay playing horribly, to your point, right? Like, there was a lot of stuff that happened this offseason, and when I think back, back to the Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah hire, the Kevin O'Connell hire, and we kind of looked at that, and it was obviously cool for somebody like me, for somebody like Kwesi to get a job like that. And, when they made the decision to sign Kirk Cousins for a year and, go into the future, we saw the USA Today article by Jory Epstein, where Adolfo-Mensah said, Kirk's not a great quarterback, but he's our quarterback, and, more or less, and he got a lot of flack for that. And he's been right about that, but he's also been right about the league as a whole and how flat it was to be. And you think about it, well, okay, Tom Brady's 45 years old. Like, at some point, the ball's got to fall off the table with him. Drew Brees retired a couple of years ago. Phillip Rivers retired a couple of years ago. Big Ben, retired a couple of years ago. Morally and absolutely this offseason. And sort of you see, okay, you have a drafts like the 2018 draft, which had a lot of first-round quarterbacks. Really only 2 have been any good, right? The 2019 draft, you talk about, Daniel Jones. That was mostly a flop, although his team's 5-1. Kyler Murray got a contract extension, but he's not one of those like Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes guys. And so you go through the list and you're like, well, where's the next quarterbacks coming up? And you also saw what I thought to be a great sort of repositioning of teams, right? So A.J. Brown goes from Tennessee, where he's a huge surplus to Ryan Tannehill, let's be honest, an overpaid quarterback, the same way that Kirk Cousins is an overpaid quarterback. But when you have, much like the Vikings do, a wide receiver who's transcendent, making, first round pick money, you can make it work, right? And then, he's up for a contract. So then he goes to Philly to play with a guy who's a $1 million quarterback. Well, now Ryan Tannehill, what's he's going to do with his hands at this point, right? And you look at Aaron Rodgers, you had him and Devontae Adams. Devontae Adams goes to Vegas and plays with Derek Carr. Well, Derek Carr's not good enough to fully be a Super Bowl team, even when he has Adams. So there's a great sort of regression there, but then there's regression in Green Bay, because as we saw with the Vikings in week 1, who's he going to throw to, and so, other than, Allen, who I think we all agree, if you took Stephon Diggs away, he'd still be good. And Mahomes, which you already saw, they took Tyreek Hill away, replaced him with Smith-Schuster, Valdez-Scantling, and Sky Moore. That's the second best offense in the league right now. Like, other than those guys, and there's probably 2 of them in the league altogether, like, everybody else is getting smushed to the middle. And credit Adolfo-Mensah. He saw that and he said, look, if we can just get above like average coaching at the end of games, special teams, like at the margins, take a team that basically played a bunch of one-score games last year with an easy schedule. And look, I think 5-1 is well beyond how they've played, but 5-1 was within the realm of possibility. And in fact, if they had gotten unlucky, let's say lost to Detroit and lost to, one of the 2, New Orleans, or Chicago, even if they were 3-3 right now, I think they'd be in a much better position than they had been the previous 2 seasons. So credit to them for understanding the landscape of the league, and which is bad, like unequivocally bad. This landscape of the league is bad. And it's going to make for an interesting second half.
It's crazy because I think the fully healthy roster last year is better than this fully healthy roster. And I think that compared to 2018 or 2019, I don't even think it's close. I think those teams are much better than what they are running out right now. But you look at last year's schedule, and it was actually pretty hard. At the time, we thought the Bengals was a bad loss, and then they went to the Super Bowl, and Arizona turned out to be a pretty good team. So some of the teams they lost close to early on when they had the full roster, but then when they had some injuries as they went along, that's where things fell apart. And this team has been completely healthy outside of some rookies that weren't making contributions anyway. That's a huge element of this when you talk about living on the razor's edge and winning games in the final minutes or by 1 score. Well, you're a lot healthier than the Miami Dolphins, who had more injuries within the game than you've had all season long, which I think, plays into this as well. And that's why with Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah in the direction. And by the way, the owners even said they were the ones that set the direction. So I'm not sure I want to go like all in saying this GM brilliantly saw this coming. I think that was the owner's edict from the very beginning, and then he followed it. And I'm not even sure that they followed it in the best way they could have, because when you look at some of the short-term plays, okay, Zadarius Smith was a good one. That is a multi-year contract, so it's a little bit more extended out. Harrison Phillips has been okay. That's a multi-year contract, all right. But some of these other ones, Like, those are really short-term deals that are going to punch huge holes in your roster in the future that I'm not sure how exactly you're going to fix. And extending someone like Adam Thielen, who is averaging like 9 yards a catch at this point. I mean, there were just a lot of moves that wouldn't have made a huge difference to where they are now. And one of them is at quarterback. Marcus Mariota averages a whole yard per attempt more than Kirk Cousins at this moment. I mean, are they not 5-1 with him or 4-2 with him? And yet you're spending a lot less. You could fill up the other parts of the roster better. Atlanta's not even a good team. They're 500. So I think there's like a counterpoint to the, like, well, they brilliantly saw it coming. Like, or has everything so much gone their way that it kind of looks like this? And now the big question is, can you turn this good break of a 5-1 start? And I mean, they could very easily be 7-1 when they play Arizona and when they play Washington. Can you turn this into something real? Which is my next question for you. Is like, if I told you that they turned this into something real and they won 12 games and we're at the top of the NFC right behind, say, Philadelphia, how would that have to happen? Because right now the statistical indicators are suggesting that's not a thing that they should be able to do.
Yeah, they're 13th. I think they'll go up a little bit, but they're 13th in PFF's power rankings. They're like 17th in Football Outsiders DVOA, which I can cite now that I don't work for PFF anymore. And you know, the market ratings have, you know, Ben Baldwin's market ratings have them right around, you know, middle 10th, right? 10th to 12th or so. But that's, again, because not a lot of teams in the NFL. Like, the funny thing is, relative, like you said, like, even relative to the last 2 years, the big difference is the quarterback play is worse, like much worse. And in fact, you know, the last time you and I were on the show together, I said they could perform better and Cousins could have worse statistics. And part of me is thinking to myself, it's like, these two things have been roughly similar the last 2 years, except when you play better teams, you have to it forces the quarterback to be aggressive at the end of the games when they're behind. And that's where he piles up some of his statistics. Now, it's not meaningless, right? Because he does, in many cases, bring the team back and take a lead. And he's done that this year against New Orleans. He's done that this year against Chicago. He did that, he's done that before. And he actually had some big throws the other day. But like, within that, all the 3 and outs, those have been there for a couple of years now. You know, it's just that when they're a combination, and I'm going to heavily lean towards when it's a combination of playing bad teams with backup quarterbacks, you never get to see the one drive a game that takes Kirk Cousins from 6.5 yards per pass attempt to 7.5 yards per pass attempt, because they don't have to. Like, they're ahead in these games, so you never see, you know, Kirk Cousins, 1, 2, 3, throw a deep ball to Justin Jefferson. You can, as an observer, decide which division of credit you want there. I'm going to go more on Jefferson than Cousins, but that part is censored out of his data this year because they're ahead, because they're playing worse teams. The defense is like 21st in Football Outsiders DVOA. You are seeing good pressure numbers, but you also are seeing like significant chunk plays. You look at that Chicago team, and that's a team that scored 7 points on Sunday, or at home on Thursday night, against a bad Washington team that put up good numbers against you. And if Cam Dantzler doesn't make an incredible individual play, you might lose that game. So to answer your question, like, it's so weird because this 5-1 team needs to turn it around to actually be good. Now, the benefit is we've seen this team turn it around before in the middle of the season. We saw it in 2020. They started 1-5. They got to 6-6. Last season, they started 1-3. They got to 500 a few times. They have been able to turn it around. The two things I want to say is stacking up 5 wins in the first 6 games is not insignificant, because if you turn it around, you're going to be adding to those 5 wins, which means you're going to get playoff seeding that you're going to want. You're going to get home games in January, and that's wonderful. The question is like, we've also seen the same thing happen. They start out slowly, they turn it around in the middle of the year, and then they don't figure it out in the end of the season. And then if that happens this year, they're very likely going to be a playoff team that goes into, much like 2019, goes into the playoffs a little bit weaker than we all expected. I think, for example, the 2019 season, that team in the middle of the year was as good as it ever was that year. And I do know they beat New Orleans, but when they went to San Francisco, they were truly outclassed by a 49ers team that made the Super Bowl. So I guess my worry is, okay, let's say that happens. So let's say they figure it out here. They win games they're supposed to win. They trail off a little bit at the end because their quarterback looks a little older this year, and he does look a little weaker throwing the football. Adam Thielen, as we predicted, is pretty much washed at this point. KJ Osborne has not taken the next step. Dalvin Cook is famine, feast, and as the end of the season goes, those feasts might go away. Offensive line has been shaky. The rookies are not going to offer anything this year. Let's say Tampa, Green Bay, LA, and Philly. Philly's already good, but let's say those teams all figure it out. Are the Vikings a favorite in the playoffs? I would say no. But I do think I do think that the answer is they can be a for real team. But I think the most likely outcome is they're going to go into the playoffs with a pretty damn good record, and we're going to be surprised that they're not even favored by that much in those games. And we're also going to be surprised, like we might also see an upset by a team that just comes in with a much better quarterback, because that's the recipe in the playoffs. And unfortunately, right now, I think most Vikings fans, even the most ardent Kirk Cousins supporters, don't think that he's got it right now.
Yeah, the thing for me that's that I kind of am swinging back and forth on is we have certainly seen sections of seasons from Kirk Cousins where he averaged 6 yards a pass and where he had an 80-something quarterback rating and didn't grade particularly well by PFF. Heck, the end of last season. And this is where I can run this right now if my computer won't melt while I'm trying to do this. But I mean, if we go back to the end of last season and look at the extended sample size on Cousins, there is some reason to be like, what exactly is going on here? But there's also reason to think that because of his history, he has progression, I guess, where he can like have one of those hot months, and he certainly has the upcoming opponents to think about it. Let me look at it like what his last 17 games looks like. Oh, it's Pro Football Reference is just exploding as I try to do this, so that is not helping me. But not the website. I'm just having trouble searching the game log. But even if we go back to the end of last year, like it's now been a while since he has looked like the guy who puts up like those huge numbers you talk about. And he had like a 70-yard game that they won against Chicago last year, had a game against Los Angeles that was a major
Pittsburgh
struggle.
That was mostly Dalvin Cook. And
right.
It's tough because the questions that I have are when's the cavalry coming, right? In 2020, you had no Justin Jefferson in the first two games, and Kirk looked horrendous. You put Jefferson in against Tennessee, he was amazing, and you sort of had this buoying stage where once the defense, started playing weaker offenses, you saw how this team could win football games. Last year it was Christian Darrisaw. Christian Darrisaw came in the middle of the season, started protecting the passer a lot better than Rashad Hill did, and we saw great things. I think that the hard realization right now for Vikings fans is barring a trade, and I don't think Adolfo Mensah is the kind of general manager who is going to like shove the chip. I know, the ownership gave him the edict. I also think it's good. It was good on him to sort of, I think it's going to generate a lot of goodwill this year for him. So I think it was still smart. But I also think that the test for him is going to say, okay, how do you view this season in the landscape of reality? And if he goes and blows draft capital on some players to try to get this team into the Super Bowl, I think we have our answer. I think if he doesn't, I think we also have an answer, and it's a good one in that he understands where this team sits. Are they going to win a Super Bowl game against Buffalo? No, there's no way. I do not see them beating Josh Allen in a game. Kansas City, a little bit weaker, but I still don't think the Vikings would have a chance in that game. So, what are you really doing here? I think barring a trade, this is as good as personnel as this team's going to get, right? And there's no one walking through that door the way they did in 2021 when it was Darrisaw. It was a little bit of evolution in the offensive line, and Dalvin Cook getting a little healthier. And then in 20, it was Justin Jefferson turning into the best wide receiver in football. Like there's nothing here. Like, do they play Kene Nwangu? He hasn't had a carry this year. Like, there's no one sitting on the bench anywhere that's going to make this team better. This is who they are. So I guess my issue with them getting better is going to be, where is it going to come from? Thielen I just think is on a downward trajectory. Cook is just on a downward trajectory. Maybe Irv Smith gives him something, but I don't think that's, and Justin Jefferson is already amazing. It's as good as it's going to get for Jefferson in this team. And of course, offensive line has been healthy throughout the whole year. If you sustain an injury or two there, only God knows what will happen then. So I think that that's the worry, is like you much like 2017 just have to hope that the team stays healthy for the majority of the season. And that's the tricky part for the Vikings here is health, because every other team in large part is struggling because they've lacked that.
So I got it to work. Last 10 games for Cousins. Now, so he had, when they lost to Detroit, he had a big statistical game that day in the Detroit loss. After that, though, was the Pittsburgh game, and that's when everything looked weird. But that's also when Thielen got hurt and has never been the same. And he limps every game now, and I think that might be playing into the explosiveness where the separation down the field just isn't the same. So Thielen went down in that Detroit game and didn't play against Pittsburgh and so forth. And so in the last 10 games, Cousins has an 89.4 quarterback rating and averages 6.91 yards per pass attempt. Those are numbers that you would expect if you had to start like an average backup quarterback for 10 games. He's got 17 touchdowns, 9 picks, 237 yards passing per game. Like, those are not star quarterback numbers at all. And I think that if you're asking where it can get better, is if those numbers get better, if they start to come back around, because I did a statistical bad and I did the arbitrary endpoint, but I also did when you don't have two receivers. And this is something that you have really looked into in the past, is when you rely on one guy all the time, that there's answers for that. And the other day when Justin Jefferson has 107 yards and they finish with like 178 passing, that is just not a recipe to beat anyone. So I think that where it really comes, first of all, I'm not going to do I told you so because I feel bad that Lewis Seen got hurt. But if Jamison Williams was coming off the IR right now, boy, that'd be exciting. Anyway, I don't have anything like against,
or if they had, I mean, the honest to God's truth, and we hate to relitigate this, but like Zadarius Smith is probably the most expensive and best free agent signing the Vikings have made in the Kirk Cousins era. Second, by the way, or depending upon how you do the contracts, Dalvin Tomlinson, who's also played wonderful football, to Rick Spielman's credit, honestly, last year. But like, you just didn't have the money to go out there and get a DJ Chark or a Christian Kirk or, somebody. And again, like, these guys aren't difference makers in a vacuum, but my research in 2021, looked at, secondary receivers, and, an offense goes, the EPA for an offense goes as the second and third receivers go. And in fact, in playoff games, which means you're playing teams that are healthy, you're playing teams that have the personnel to beat you, right? And it's why Green Bay has struggled, because in 14 games a year, you're playing teams like the Lions and the Vikings, and you can just throw at Adams all game, right? But if you're in the playoffs, there is almost no correlation between your EPA in that game throwing the football and how good your number one receiver is, meaning like they can take your number one receiver out when these games matter the most. And, that's what I worry about, because again, Thielen's been a tremendous Viking. He's probably going to go Ring of Honor. He's among, the great receivers in the franchise. But when you look, his yards per route runs 2, 1.75, 1.5. And then this year, I don't have the numbers after last week. You're talking about like 1.2 yards per route run. A little bit of that is some of them playing 3 wide receiver sets. And my intern, Zach Drapkin, wrote about that. But that also underscores the Vikings went from a 2 wide receiver offense to a 3 wide receiver offense, and they didn't get extra wide receivers. They drafted Jalen Naylor out of Michigan State. And, that's just not a way to build a team. And this isn't to ding Adolfo-Mensah, because they didn't have the cap space to do it, right? They needed a second pass rusher. They needed, to shore up a secondary that has somehow stayed together with toothpicks and glue. And like, so it's just one of the issues they're going to have to deal with. But to your point, like, it would be really nice to get a wide receiver into the room right now, because the stuff they banked on, which is Adam Thielen hanging on and KJ Osborne taking the next step, BC Johnson staying healthy. Of course, that didn't happen. Like, none of those things are coming to fruition. Like, this is who they're going into the second half of the season with. And unfortunately, like, if I was at the poker table, I would pick up and go at this point. Like that's how it goes, because, they've already gotten, I think, the best of it.
It's kind of a yes and no with the receiver thing, though, because not drafting one, waiting until the 6th round is, and instead, look, the right guard at Ingram may become a good player. He is not a good pass protector right now. In fact, he's one of the worst pass protectors by PFF in the entire league. If you were playing Chris Reed, you're probably better off significantly, which again is like, that's a long-term thing. He could be a good player for you. It's also a guard. And in comparison to the value, another wide receiver, as you just laid out, maybe even in the 2nd round or something, could have helped there. I mean, I was in on drafting a corner, but they drafted one who had a very significant injury history, again, with receivers. They've just ignored receivers in the draft outside of Justin Jefferson for many years now and thought, no, we'll just keep drafting him in the back end. And Osborne is nice, but like the ceiling there is not as high as it is for someone in the 1st round. Not only that, they also spent money on someone like Jordan Hicks, who again, I really respect him as a veteran player, and he's kind of solid, but then you draft a 3rd round linebacker who's not playing or is barely playing. Where did that money go? And then it's, a defensive tackle, Harrison Phillips, who I think has been solid against the run, but where did that money go? As opposed to what was going to drive you as a successful team, which is really your passing game. So now we've reached a point where it's like, that's the relitigation of the offseason, and a little bit of, and I'm sorry to do it, but a little bit of, I told you so, with the, like, you definitely needed another wide receiver here. You don't have one. So for me, it's entirely, how do you get KJ Osborne the ball more often? Because he's not going to line up on the outside and roast dudes. Like, it's just not, he's not Jefferson. He's not Thielen, but I also think he's much better than what we've seen so far. And this is where it ties in to Kevin O'Connell. This is a real test. In fact, this is maybe a harder test than if you had started off mediocre and everyone is like, I don't know, that's just who they are. 5-1. Now you're expected to be good. And now, and now you have to fix these things to maintain the good. So I think this is a really great first test for someone who I think has really done a lot of the things that he promised to do, which, if you've seen some of the other coaches around the league, doesn't always happen. So I'm very impressed with a lot of things, but this, I think, is his first huge test as a head coach. How do you keep this going when there's a lot of things that I think need to be a little better if you're going to make it a 12-win season?
Yeah, my co-host on the Kansas City Chiefs podcast, the Red, Gold, and Bold show, Saran Petro, he said, it's why the loser in a rematch has a little bit of advantage, because the winner, if they change their game plan, people are going to say, well, why the hell did you go away from what worked? I think that's what O'Connell has the issue with. I do think, and this is a credit to you, I think, as the best, Vikings content creator out there. I think most Vikings fans look at this team and they're like, it's not a very good team, right? Like I'm fairly sure that unless you're going to some of the scammy sites and stuff like that, like they know, right? Like, and I want to say, and this is back to the Adolfo-Mensah bit as well, is maybe maybe their plan was not to win this year, or if they won, it was going to be, and how I say it, on accident, right? And so maybe when we say, well, why didn't they get a number 2 receiver? Why didn't they do this? Why didn't they do that? It was like, well, they couldn't do everything, right? So they felt like they did the best thing they could for the future, which is to get a bunch of secondary players in there, try to develop them. They're thinner there, frankly, than they are at wide receiver, which is hard to do. And just say, if Adam Thielen doesn't turn out, if KJ Osborne doesn't turn out, you charge it to the game, you move on to 2023, and we weren't that good anyway, and we didn't have the resource to be that good, right? So that's a little bit of a point I want to make on like what they could have done. Maybe that was their thought process. On the O'Connell thing, it's absolutely like, if they change anything up, like let's say they go more, let's say they do, they run Dalvin Cook more, or they go more pass happy, they go with, more Irv Smith or something like that. People are going to be like, well, what you did work the first 6 games of the year. What the hell are you doing? And it's like, well, no, actually it didn't work. Like they just played the Bears, and the Bears suck. And they're starting Skylar Thompson of Kansas State. Every man a Wildcat. Emaw is starting against them yesterday. And Andy Dalton, which, by the way, Andy Dalton's played pretty good football so far this year, but you're playing Andy Dalton in London. And you're playing in week 1 a quarterback that's been using LSD all off season, and Aaron Rodgers. So like,
hey, he was licking mushrooms. Okay.
Yeah. Like it's sort of, like I said, I think most Vikings fans and observers know that this team still has to kind of turn it around to still be a real good team. I think they're, and yeah, observing the team, I'm happy that they've won 5 of 6 games. It's just like, but they do need to change it. And I think that is really the tough thing for O'Connell is I think he's been really good on the margins. I think he's done a good job of hiding his quarterback to this extent. I think he's done a good job of the end of halves have not been a disaster for him the same way they were with Zimmer. Like the special teams have been great. I think the special teams coach for the Vikings is going to be a future head coach in this league. Like all this kind of stuff is great on the margins, but like the core things that they're supposed to do, which is play efficient offense and stop people on defense, they simply haven't done. And they do need to change it up.
I never thought I would say this about any team. The special teams is keeping them alive. I'm not even kidding. Like they are at the top of the league in average drive start for and against. And the other day you get a 3 and out, you get pinned back and your punter just changes the game with a 73-yard punt. 6 of his 10 go in the 20. Like when you're asking Teddy Bridgewater to come in and go 80 yards or 85 yards down the field to score, and Miami can't even run the football, which was just a laughing stock, their offensive line. So they couldn't even really effectively run the ball. Like something like that is one of those around the margins things that they hired an absolutely brilliant special teams coach. And you see the impact of that. I think that they hired a really good offensive line coach and that we've seen, aside from this Miami game, more out of the offensive line than we have in the past. We've seen development of Christian Darrisaw. Until the Miami game, we've seen better play from Garrett Bradbury. And I think that a lot of those things have played into how they've started 5-1. It's just that, like you said, can you really rely on 73-yard punts all the time? Can you rely on last-minute fumbles all the time? And I think that's the whole point where, somebody sent me a tweet today and was like, where do I write my apology letter for us being 5-1? It was like, well, that's not really what anybody's getting at when they're talking about this. It's after the game, Kevin O'Connell says, we can't play like that from week to week and still expect to have a great season. Yeah, I also am curious. Sorry, go ahead.
If you bet on the Vikings against the spread, you've lost 4 games and won 2. Like it's still like a weird, like you've made more money betting on Detroit against the spread this year than you have the Vikings. And so there's this clouded weirdness of like they're not reaching market expectations, but they're still winning. They're finding that that crevice in the expectation that I never thought Kirk Cousins led team could. And like you said, it's like it is the special teams. It is the stuff that when those two were hired, O'Connell and Afo-Mensah, they said, we're going to work together. We're going to try to be a holistic group and stuff like that. And like we all thought, and I think for the most part, it's all kind of like words, but having a special teams that is not a disaster and understanding to take 40 seconds off the clock at the end of the first half, as opposed to letting Jesus take the wheel with timeouts. Like you will, like that is those scores matter and those yards matter and they're being helped out there in that regard. But I don't think anybody has to apologize if they doubted the Vikings. Like this is not a team that is necessarily good. They just won games.
Well, and I think that the person's point was like, do I have to apologize for being excited about them? And I think the answer is no. Like, of course you don't have to apologize for being excited about 5-1 because it sets you up to be better, to make corrections. And of course the schedule is still not super scary the rest of the way. And I think in the long term, what it does is it allows for certain things to happen sort of naturally, which is you have a good season here, but Cousins doesn't have the numbers that he did before. And you start to look toward the future and say, well, we've got a lot of bones of something for the future with Justin Jefferson, of course, starting out there, and draft picks that you made for the secondary that you're hoping will eventually come to fruition. But the emergence of some players like Cam Dantzler, Cam Bynum, guys who can be on rookie contracts and go into the future with you, guys like that. And you could say we could have a winning season, then draft a quarterback, play it out with Cousins through the next year where he's under contract and turn it over to the next guy. And then have some of these players like Darrisaw, whoever else that they've drafted recently on the offensive line, Cleveland and Bradbury and whatever, staying together for a long time. And you can sort of see it all kind of come together, like the lady with the numbers in the GIF there, right? So my question to you though is, and this is like mostly tongue in cheek, but a little bit of serious, should no one ever draft a quarterback again? Like, what is going on? I just was looking at these last 4 drafts. Like you said, Kyler Murray is struggling. Daniel Jones is bad. The rest of that draft class didn't work out. Joe Burrow is a megastar. So is Justin Herbert. Tua on the fence so far. Hurts might be a star. And everybody else, man, like Mac Jones might have lost his job to Bailey Zappi. You have Kenny Pickett that I don't know that he can play. Trevor Lawrence is sort of like sputtering around where he makes progress and then has a step back. And I mean, we've talked about like the draft, the quarterback thing is a solution for the Vikings for a long time, but now I'm seeing like Mariota and Geno Smith and these other like, I'm mostly kidding, but I feel like the way that these draft classes have gone has got to be a little bit scary for teams.
Yeah, I see. I disagree vehemently, and here's why. I don't like you when we look at what the goal is. It's to win, right? And in a league, and I agree that like the easiest path. We all watch the 425 game, Buffalo, Kansas City. That's the path. Find a guy who is, as the kids say, him, and nothing else matters. You know, Mahomes is throwing to a guy named Sky Moore, right? Like, you know, we have, you know, that's the way to go about it. But everybody else lives in a different reality. And the hard part is if Geno Smith keeps playing this way, like he's not on team control. That dude's making $30 million next year, and then life gets really fair when you're paying Geno Smith $30 million, right? Just like it got fair for the Vikings when they paid Kirk Cousins that much money. So I look at a team like the Jets, for example, a team that my former podcast co-host derided significantly. Zach Wilson's not playing great football, but you know what? When you can sign Carl Lawson and when you can sign Laken Tomlinson and you know, Dwayne Brown on a pinch, right? Like the Vikings could never sign Dwayne Brown with the quarterback contract they have, but the Jets can just write it off because they got a quarterback making hardly any money. You know, Garrett Wilson, Elijah Moore, Corey Davis, a big free agent signing, old Vikings friend Tyler Conklin, tight end, you know, to go along with CJ Uzama from the Bengals, over and over. And you're like, why are the Jets good? It's like, my brother in Christ, they got every freaking player on the team. Like, you know, and of course they're going to be good. And I think about this, like the Bears with Trubisky have made the playoffs more than the Vikings with Cousins have. Because again, when you got that quarterback, he doesn't even have to be good on a rookie deal. You can just shovel talent around him and it becomes a thing. Since 2012, every single Super Bowl except for one has included a quarterback on rookie deal money. And you look at the Eagles, is Jalen Hurts good? I don't know. And that's the beauty of it. I don't have to know because he's got A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith, you know, Lane Johnson. You know, they go and get Hassan Reddick back, you know, former Temple guy to play defensive end. They got Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, James Bradbury. Like they just got players. And so if you can get Cousins off your books and you can get a rookie quarterback in there, and then you got Jefferson, which I've said this before, re-signing Jefferson is going to be harder than it sounds. You get Jefferson in there and you start to build this thing up. I think next year is going to be a little rougher of a year than people believe, but you got to draft a quarterback because the blueprint is there. And unfortunately, the seasons you're seeing out of Mariota, the season you're seeing out of Geno Smith, they're pop-up years, that they're transient. They just happen. And at least when you get a guy like Mac Jones going 10-7 for New England, you don't have to sign him to that big deal, right? You know, when you get a quarterback on a rookie deal, you can see that success and not immediately have to pay for it the next year. You know, if the Falcons decide to go with Mariota, they're going to have to pay him right now because he's not on team control. Same thing with Geno in Seattle. And so that is the way to like build a roster, is to have that quarterback where the concerns about his money are fixed. And then you just, if he's good, you shovel talent around him. And if you're the Jets and if Darnold sucks, you just move on. And then, you know, you try again with Zach Wilson and you try again with the next quarterback. And you know, if you hit on all those guys at once, then you're the Jets and you're walking into Lambeau Field and you're winning 27-10. And that's despite a quarterback who I will, you know, as a Zach Wilson supporter early on, I will say has not played great.
Yeah, I think that the advantage remains as large as it ever was or as that we thought. But we've just seen so many of these go up in flames recently that it's really stood out, that when we were told certain draft classes were going to change the entire face of the NFL, it hasn't happened, which has opened the door to your Geno Smiths and your Marcus Mariotas and teams making desperate plays at quarterback, like trading for Matt Ryan, trading for Russell Wilson, because the quarterbacks were not there to draft or they didn't hit on them. If Denver hits on Drew Lock, then they'd be talking about doing this same thing. But instead he was a miss and Jalen Hurts was the hit. So Philadelphia gets to be the genius and Denver gets to be the fools, right? Because they made a desperate play for an older veteran quarterback who, by the way, doesn't run anymore. And, if this is his breakout game before we're recording this before Monday Night Football. So then sorry, no apologies to Russell Wilson. It's still not a great move to take a risk on a quarterback who's the same age as when Donovan McNabb completely fell apart. But to your point, if we're trying to lay out the Vikings timeline, this is why it's so important that you take full advantage. And I mean, home playoff games, division championship, everything you can to win this year. And I don't know what they could do at the trade deadline with their cap situation, but if there's something reasonable, what Robbie Anderson was acquired for a sixth, like get in on these phone calls if you can, because as you go into the future, it's going to get harder. Kirk isn't going to get younger. He is not going to get cheaper because no one is getting cheaper in the NFL. So everything aligns for even the Vikings, and there's a lot of teams that need quarterbacks, to even attempt to trade up or something like that. And I completely agree with you that there's a lot of ways to be a good team and to be a really competitive team, but there's only one way to be a great team for a long time. And we saw it on Sunday when Buffalo played Kansas City. That's to draft dudes who have insane arms that do things that break my brain every possession with those two guys. And there's a couple quarterbacks in this next draft who can do that. I really like Anthony Richardson. I think that people who are like, oh, he doesn't throw the ball that good or something, like first of all, he does, like a lot of times their team isn't very good, but also like, look at the skill there. Look at the talent there. If you want to win for many years, that's what you're going to have. Otherwise, you're just taping it together and being like, oh, what a good story our journeyman quarterback is this year, but that will not last.
Well, and the other thing, and this is something that, we saw, like, I was talking to our friend Sage Rosenfels while I was in Nebraska last week, and it was like, there's also the aspect of you have to be able to see with these quarterbacks the unseeable, because college, like, there's no way he's getting the best. And I know Napier's a decent coach, but like, there's no way Anthony Richardson is getting the absolute best coaching. The same way as Patrick Mahomes, when he had Cliff Kingsbury, was not getting the absolute best coaching. And he goes to, and Andy Reid has his faults, but he goes to Kansas City and the guy's a god because the talent is there. Same thing with Josh Allen, and it took Allen a little bit longer. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it's just the way to win is to have a quarterback that overcomes so many things, and without insane talent, it's just going to be hard. And, Brady did win a Super Bowl. Stafford did win a Super Bowl. I do think that we also, the lesson here is that variance is a bad teacher, right? When you see a 5-seeded Tampa Bay win a Super Bowl and a 4-seeded LA win a Super Bowl, and then everybody after that is like, oh, I guess, okay, all right, Colts, we're going after Matt Ryan, right? We're going after, Russell Wilson. We're going at, Aaron Rodgers was the preferred choice to Denver, and it didn't work out. And it's like, well, how's that working out now? It's kind of you got to hit a royal flush for these things to work. And you have to hit a good hand to win a Super Bowl anyway. But I got to tell you, the Chiefs have made 4 straight AFC title games, and there's some bad football that Chiefs team has played over the last 4 years. You don't have to have as good of a hand at the poker table if you're the Bills or the Chiefs. You have to have an absolutely amazing, if not perfect one, if you're going to try to emulate what the Rams and the Bucks did with their quarterbacks. And so, like, and hopefully Kwesi believes this, if you're a Vikings fan, like, let the other teams chase that kind of nonsense while the Anthony Richardsons of the world and the CJ Strouds and the Bryce Young, who was fantastic Saturday against Tennessee in a loss, like, let the rest of the league chase those guys. You chase the first round. You chase the tried and true thing of drafting a guy with immense skills, putting a coach that you trust in charge of him, giving him wide receivers like Jefferson, and hopefully, if you're a Vikings fan, another guy to pair with Jefferson, and see what's possible, because that's really the only formula that works long term in the NFL.
Before you go, how many wins do the Vikings end up with?
I haven't gone through the schedule one by one, but I think it's 11. I think it's 11 or 12. I think they win this division. We'll see. I mean, they're not that good, so they could drop to Detroit a couple times. That they've already beaten Green Bay and Chicago both at home, although, but it's just not that hard for them down the stretch. And in fact, as we said here, they could get better. And if they get better, some of these games are going to be easier than what we've seen previously, which would be a breath of fresh air for Vikings fans.
Now the Sumer Sports Show. I have become a listener. You and former NFL GM Thomas Dimitrov doing a weekly show, and people can find your work there and at Eric Eager _, now on Twitter, which is just.
I copied my friend Austin Gale, who did the same thing, and it's easy. They can find, there's like a state senator in Texas named Eric Eager, unfortunately. So kudos to him for squatting on that first.
I'm not going to make any jokes, and I'm just going to end the show. So great stuff, Eric. Great to get together with you again. We will do it again soon, sir.
Thanks for having me.